You know, I'm happy that nobody's tried to revive Stargate today. I'd hate to see people ruin that too. Before there was a universe, before there was Atlantis, before there was even SG-1. But after Defender 2, there was Stargate, the original 1994 motion picture that took 3 years to spawn a franchise of sorts. However, back in the day, you didn't need to be a big franchise with a massive following to get a video game. You just needed a hit movie, and here we are. Stargate for the Sega Genesis, also available for Super Nintendo. Stargate also had games on the Game Boy and the Game Gear, but as demonstrated in prior videos ages ago, those are puzzle games while this is an action game. It has action and platforming and fetch quests and stuff. And so let us begin. Released in 1994 courtesy of Acclaim and Probe Entertainment, Stargate is a side-scrolling action platform game thing in which you take control of Colonel Jack O'Neill, with one L and no sense of humor. And you, along with your party, are stranded on another planet thanks to the Stargate, and you're tasked with various goals to find your way back home, and to do that, you'll have to roam across these levels and uncover gimmicks and doohickeys and stuff. So your main weapon's a machine gun, for which you have unlimited ammo, but is prone to overheating, which limits your trigger finger. You also have a limited number of grenades. There are occasional pickups that you'll come across, health pickups, additional grenades and lives, and some temporary upgrades to your rifle, such as rapid fire and coolant to prevent overheating for a short while. For the most part, your main goal throughout the game is to accomplish tasks given to you by various characters, whether it be Daniel Jackson, the old guy whose name I don't recall, or some other member of your team among others. Said task usually involves seeking out missing soldiers, missing supplies, missing natives, or whatever the case may be. Sometimes it'll be meeting a specific individual who will direct you to your next challenge. Stargate only has a couple boss fights throughout its 10-ish or so level campaign, and so your opposition is mostly against small bugs and the occasional Horus guards, of which there are a variety of, especially later in the game. In addition to going through the levels and completing your given tasks, Stargate charges you with 2 additional priority objectives that you'll have to complete if you want to get the game's best ending. One is finding all 7 hieroglyphs required in order to assemble the Stargate address to send your team home. The other is to find all 7 pieces for the nuclear bomb that you're supposed to use to blow up the planet. All 14 of these collectibles are scattered throughout the game, and failure to complete either of these tasks will net you a bad ending. Either you're stranded, Ra ends up with the bomb to use against you, or both. This means in addition to the fetch quest you'll partake in to advance in the game, you're given 2 more fetch quests that you'll need to complete in order to truly defeat Ra and return home victorious, and potentially spawn a franchise of sorts. So in case it hasn't been hammered enough times already, Stargate is an action game that also features some platforming bits as well as some fetch quests. Most of the time you're scouring these rather open-ended levels looking for the things you need to recover in order to progress onwards. This encourages, or rather requires, the player to explore his surroundings a little bit in order to find these key items as well as other potential helpings. This also, unfortunately, results in quite a bit of tedium, as you'll be tasked with fetch quest after fetch quest after fetch quest, with the occasional just reach the end of the level or beat the end boss tossed in for good measure. It does not make for an interesting game in the long run, and Stargate's 10 levels are a rather lengthy endeavor with sprawling mazes you'll have to navigate, some tricky platforming, and lots of smallish foes that are difficult to hit. Credit for trying to make Stargate more than just a straightforward go from point A to point B linear affair, but maybe that would have been the better option in this case. Now fortunately, O'Neill is a somewhat nimble fellow due to his still being portrayed by Kurt Russell at this point. He runs fairly quickly, he can climb ropes and hang on to ledges. His only weakness lies in his jumping. They're not very reliable, and taking a rather nasty fall will stun O'Neill for a bit, leaving him vulnerable to attack. O'Neill can attack in any 8 directions, which you'll need to do if he wants to hit anything resembling a target. A lot of the opposition you'll face in Stargate comprises small bugs, and more often than not, they'll be hard to hit due to their small size and somewhat erratic movement. Control is pretty smooth, generally responsive, and fairly simple to figure out. Gameplay in general is pretty decent, the action ain't too shabby. Could use more variety in level design. Running around in mostly caves, deserts, and ancient tombs adds to the general sense of monotony brought about by the fetch quests, but on the other hand, given that Abydos is largely a desert planet and you don't start seeing the inside of a spaceship until the very end, creative license and all that, there's only so much you could do in this regard. Stargate does boast a password system to resume your progress at a later time, and you could choose from one of 3 difficulties to set your game and stuff. In terms of graphics, Stargate is fine, I guess. I think the character sprites are somewhat bland looking in both design and detail, but at least the animation's fairly smooth. Not sure if they pulled off some sort of rotoscoping technique or something, but the character movement for O'Neill at least is fairly slick here. The level backdrops are also fairly neatly rendered and fairly clean looking for the most part. The conversation bits between a grainy looking O'Neill with one L and a grainy looking anyone else he might be talking to is a thing. Nothing special, but it is a thing. The only thing I really don't like is that you don't shoot any visible projectiles from your gun. Instead, you fire a bunch of invisible bullets that will hit something, and puffs of smoke on the point of impact is your only visual indication that you're hitting something. It might be realistic, I suppose, and certainly fine for something like a first-person shooter or anything with a hit scan, but it doesn't quite work here and actually hinders more than it enhances. Probably the weakest aspect of Stargate is the audio. There's no familiar Stargate theme or anything heard from the movie, or rather you have a bunch of largely original tracks that try to mimic the sound of David Arnold's original film score. And I'll say this much, on Super Nintendo, this kinda sorta almost nails it, but not so much on the Mega Drive, which naturally sounds more synthy and comes across as more of a techno remix sort of thing. Admittedly, after a while this did grow on me and I kinda dig it now. Sound effects are weak sauce, however, no matter how you slice it. Machine gun sounds like a pop gun, explosions sound like a wet fart, and anytime you grab a pickup, you get an ugly twang sound. Not a fan of the sound output in this regard, we could have done so much better here. Overall, Stargate is a fairly competent, if not somewhat dull, little action game. It's got its moments, sure, and the gameplay's pretty solid, but after a while the whole fetch quest aspect of the game starts to wear a bit thin and you just wish you were playing something a little more straightforward and a little more action-packed. Also worth mentioning is that the Genesis version is missing the Death Glider segment, though I don't know if that's much of a loss when the rest of the game isn't as strong. Still, it's an interesting little curio for Stargate fans who probably never played this one, and I don't know, it's fine for a lark on the cheap, but there are better run-and gunners, platformers, and action games on the Genesis that do what Stargate does, but better. This one is firmly middle-of-the-road territory. Good enough to be playable, possibly even enjoyable, but probably won't hold your interest for very long.